Welcome to Chapters and Chisme, where Latinas talk books, spill publishing tea, and share the stories behind the stories. I'm your host, Suanny, and today I'm joined by Ashley Brozic, who is a journalist and a creative, and most recently the author of The Little Book of Miami Style. Today, we're diving into the Miami aesthetic, Chonga style included, Latina designers, and the publishing chisme on how this book came to be. Hope you love the episode. Hi, Ashley.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining us in the first ever episode of Chapters and Chisme. I'm so excited you're here to talk about your book, The Little Book of Miami Style.
Thank you. I'm honored to be your first guest.
Congratulations on publishing your first book.
Thank you.
And tell me a little bit more about your background, your career, how you got to this point.
Sure. So I kind of live in two worlds. So I'm a journalist, but I also work as a copywriter and marketer. I kicked off my career fresh out of college. I applied to a job at Vox Media, and at the time they had this entity called Racked, and Racked covered all the sample sales in New York and in LA and whatnot, and then grew to become more of like a fashion website or fashion blog. And they were launching other city sites, so I applied and I became the Miami editor, which was a dream. So I'm like 22 years old with an editor role covering the city's, fashion industry. And I did that for like 3.5 years. They shuttered the sites, unfortunately, because, the media landscape is quick and it moves fast. So I went into advertising and marketing for a few years. I worked for an agency and we did experiential marketing for Bacardi. So for 5 years, we were promoting all of their brands. I worked a lot with their tequila brand, Cazadores, as well as Dewar's Whiskey, both as an account manager, so just driving a lot of their experiential programming, and then also as I switched over to the creative side because, I'm a writer at heart and I wanted to work with more brands. I also moved to another Hispanic agency, and I learned that I was also a Spanish copywriter, which is always a fun thing to fall into. I got the job and they're like, you could write Spanish, right? I'm like, yeah, I was an AP Spanish. Like,
Yeah, I can do this.
I could do it.
And you're Cuban, right?
I'm Cuban.
Yeah.
I don't appear to be, but I am. And so, I did that for probably 2 years, and then I branched out and I went fully freelance. Took some time to myself, and in the midst of getting married and whatnot, this opportunity came by to write this book, and it was great. This was March of 2024. I said, "Oh my God, thank you! I would love to. I'm getting married next month, so I'll start working on it after." And it was great. It was super, super cool. And then from there, I've gotten another book project, which I can share details about later. But
Yeah, that's amazing. Can you talk to me more about the publishing process of the book and how it's I know that we talked about it kind of landed on your lap, so I would love to hear more about that. I feel like that's not something that is talked about as much when you speak to authors in the publishing industry, and publishing in general is just sort of like something that people don't really know about. So I'd love to learn more about how experience that was for you.
Absolutely. And I have so much respect for people who, create a story or have an idea and then, have to go through the whole pitching process and finding an agent. I haven't done that myself, but I have a lot of respect for the people who do, and, I hope to be them one day. But I think having always contributed to the media landscape, and I write particularly about Miami. So, when I started my career, it was writing about Miami's fashion, fitness, and beauty scene. But then in later years, it was just more general. So a lot of food and drink, a lot of what to do, a lot of profiles, and talking to, just the locals, making Miami what it is, and finding interesting stories. And I think from there, the more you publish and the more you put your name out there, no matter what it is, when outside entities need someone to write about Miami, they're looking for fresh voices and they're looking for authors. And I think, sometimes you have the same people kind of writing about things. And I think it's great that, publishers and whatnot, they come and they just look for fresh voices. And I think I was someone who I wasn't writing consistently all the time, but I wrote enough I have a specific voice in my writing, and it resonated with them. So it might not resonate with someone else, but with the specialty in particular, it was great. So yeah, I think it's funny because the other book I'm working on, it's a travel guide for Louis Vuitton. They're both from the UK, so I think I'm on some like magic UK like listserv. So when they're like writer from Miami, I must pop up. And I'm very grateful to the Brits for hiring me.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a testament of your work and everything that you've built up until now.
Yeah.
So,
and I think it's important for me because both of these books are about Miami, but I think sometimes when you tell the story of the city, it's kind of one-sided. We're a city that's heavily marketed. Our image is heavily marketed. But a lot of our Latino stories aren't always told, or they're told kind of on the surface. Like, it's got Latin flair. It's got, Cuban influence. But, okay, what does that look like? And what is that? And where did it come from?
Exactly.
And I think particularly with this book, it was really important for me to make sure that, when we're talking about Miami style, it's not just, what people from outside come and like impose on us, because, we're not always wearing pastels, and we're not always wearing linen, and we're not always looking like we're going to the beach. Like, we're dressed the way the rest of America is, although with our own sort of flair. We do wear more color, and we do wear more. We're more flashier for sure, which I love. But it was to make sure that we were also including all of the Latin influence that makes the city what it is.
Right.
And our clothes are a little tighter, and like they're a little brighter, and I think that's from being Latino and like Latina.
Absolutely, I agree. I think there's so much influence, especially like, from Cuba, from Colombia. Like you can really see like the melting pot here, and in style just as much as everything else. This is a very research-intensive book. I'm sure it was for you. Tell me about the process of just writing it, like the research of it, and would also love to learn about like the design, just all of that process.
Yeah, absolutely. So part of the book was sourcing images and writing the copy, and it was a fun project because they gave me, they were like, hey, here are some chapters that we usually have in other city books. So they've done Little Book of New York style, Little Book of Copenhagen style. That's the most recent that launched along with Miami. Little Book of Seoul style, Paris, Tokyo. So I bought the entire series, and it's because it's really cute. It looks like a little rainbow in my apartment. But bought the whole series, and I looked, and there were some things in some books that I loved that I was like, oh, I would like to do this. And then there was other things that I didn't see in those books. And I was like, well, this would tell the story of Miami better. But the research was the funnest part. I went deep into, first I had to figure out like, okay, what is it that we want to write about within, I think it was 15,000 words. So I was like, all right, how do I start this? And it was quite overwhelming at the beginning because when you think of Miami on the surface, you think of Miami Vice. And I was like, okay, there's for sure a Miami Vice chapter. And there's going to be for sure like a 90s South Beach chapter. And then I was like, okay, what else?
What else? Yeah.
and I could do like an essential guide to like dressing in Miami. And that's kind of, more fun. And I could maybe highlight a few Miami designers, but what else? And so I started off at History Miami, and I was trying to see, okay, so where does Miami fashion start? And I don't know if you remember Burdines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of
so,
course.
Burdines was the Florida store. So I started with there. I was like, okay, Burdines. But what else? Why is Burdines important? History Miami Museum connected me with the research of Dr. Deirdre Clemente. And she's a fashion historian from the University of Miami, but she also did this really specific research on Miami's fashion and like textile industry. So I connected with her and I read through all of her research papers. So it was the importance of Miami's influence on resort wear, because down here, for example, Palm Beach really invented the resort wear category in America. But it was Miami as the middle class vacation down here more that we popularized it. Mm-hmm. So, a lot of the styles were made down here and marketed down here. And we would invite, fashion editors from, New York or, Paris or everywhere else. The Chamber of Commerce would essentially host them for like market weeks. And then they would come and see the summer styles down here, and whatever people were wearing between, say December and March, which is part of our season, they would just bring them up, and that's what people would wear in the summer up north. Mm-hmm. So, and what we would wear down here is it's more linens. They would wear more synthetic fabrics because we're more active. We would, you would play tennis during the day. You would go yachting. You would do a lot more walks. It was hot. So we became sort of this testing ground for what the rest of America would wear in the summer. Mm-hmm. So I realized how important that was in the beginning of Miami's foundation, because they would use that in promotional materials for the city. So they would say, next season's summer styles were started in South Florida. And they would pull out ads, the Chambers of Commerce, they would pull out ads in Vanity Fair, they would pull out ads in Vogue, they would pull out ads everywhere in major like fashion and women's lifestyle publications saying, come with your trunks empty. Burdines would pull out these ads also to come with your trunks empty and fill them up with your summer wardrobe for up north. So we used style to sell the city from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I think we still do with the sort of lifestyle of art, fashion, cars. Like now it's this sort of, it's enveloped into luxury, but back then it was specifically, summer styles start in South Florida, like come with the fashion set and, hang out here and shop here, like spend your money here, right. Which is very much, what people do now. Yeah. People come from Latin America and go to Dolphin Mall and like stock up on everything they need and send it back. Right. We have tons of outlet malls. We have, Bal Harbor Shops, which is one of the highest grossing malls in America. And it was also the first luxury mall. Miami's played a major role within the fashion industry. And we may not ever be as big as, New York or Paris in terms of designing clothing. But in terms of, retail, the specifics, summer wear season, resort wear season, we've been a super important part of that, even though we're so transient and I think we're having fun so much that we don't promote that enough, and right. We don't hold that, to such high standards, which part of my book, I would love for people to take Miami more seriously, and for Miamians to take themselves more serious in how important we are in the fashion industry, but also in other industries. Like, we don't always have to be an afterthought. Right. We play a role. Party city, right? Yeah, like we play a role in business and industry, in culture, more than just, the cheesy things that we also like to bank on. Right. We're serious, and we can be serious.
And I love that you're doing that with style. Let's talk about the designers that you feature in your book. And I was wondering if there is any Latina designers to you that come to mind when you think of any designers that have influenced Miami style in the city, but also elsewhere.
Yeah, it's actually funny because I was looking through, and the majority of designers that I featured are Latino within that book. And I think that speaks to our role within kind of the global landscape. But I think we have a number of Latin designers down here, mostly because we're this gateway to Latin America. So a lot of designers will come, they'll come here to design their clothing. They'll manufacture it elsewhere just because American manufacturing isn't as strong, and you don't get as much for your dollar, especially now. Right. But they come here to, design and whatnot. And if they're not designing their clothing here, they're displaying it, or they are making that trade here or whatnot. But
and that plays out through events like Miami Swim Week and...
Kind of. I think Miami Swim Week, yes. It plays out through events like the Latin American Fashion Summit, for example. Mm-hmm. That takes place, the next one takes place in November. And that brings a lot of like Latin American contemporary and luxury designers that are new, up and coming. And there's panels, there's workshops, and there's also a Pitch to Laughs competition, where winning designers will get a lot of great partnerships. Like, for example, on Net-a-Porter, once a year, I love to go onto the onto my app and see that you see all these Latin American designers who, through Laughs and through winning that Pitch to Laughs program, they're now sold on this major luxury retailer. Other ones too, you have Esteban Cortazar, who he grew up in South Beach in the 90s, living above News Cafe. Wow. And he has that was one of my favorite interviews for the book, but he has one of the most interesting childhoods, and he also became the youngest designer to ever show in New York Fashion Week. I think he was like 17, like super wow. young, and in his first collection, it was worn on Beyonce's Dangerously in Love, like album cover or single cover. And yeah, so you have this talent kind of coming out of here as well. There's an artistic quality to all of this that I think is really important. And I just love the way that, like, Latina designers, you know, being Latina is being super feminine, and it looks so many different ways, but it's like the celebration of femininity. That's just who we are, right? Like,
especially in Miami.
In Miami, you know, and you could be, you know, feminine in the way that, like, you're very coqueta, or you're feminine in the way that, like, you're a little bit more, like, tough and feminine. But I think, you know, being Latina, it's a celebration of that, and clothing is a super. It's the number one way we express that femininity. Yeah.
It's like the femininity embodied through the clothing.
Absolutely.
Which Latin American country do you feel has had the most influence in Miami in terms of style?
I mean, Cuban influence for sure. And I think that, you know, that permeated in the 60s and the 70s, and especially the 80s, like, with, like, the large, you know, influx there. But I think right now, Colombia is probably influencing Miami the most from a style point of view. And I think it's really exciting and fresh. You know, you have really high quality things for a really fair price point. You know, I think sometimes, like, I went to Medellin and I went shopping. I really went shopping there. And it was great because you have these really high quality things. Like, you can feel that it was, you know, made not always by artisans, but it was made with the utmost attention to detail, from the stitching and whatnot, and for price points that feel accessible. Like, you know, it's not cheap, but you feel like you're getting something for what you paid for. Right. But I think it's really exciting, the designers that come out of Colombia, you know, whether they're well-known ones or whether they're smaller and maybe you don't know them as well. But I think that is probably from Colombia and also from Brazil too. I think Brazilians also really impact our fashion down here. And they also have such fun clothing. Like, it's always really sexy, and it's always, like, you know, filled with pattern and, you know,
and colors and accessories.
Yes, and, like, you know, you just have to pair it with Havaianas.
Exactly.
Which I'm happy they're, like, back in style, but they're never really out of style.
Yeah, and it also makes sense, like, when you think of the weather here. Yeah, you're hot most of the time, so you don't want. It's different to layer, like, the way that you dress, just like the weather really impacts how you dress, obviously.
Absolutely. And I think no one understands how to dress for the heat more than, like, Latin Americans and Latinas.
Right.
Which I think is why right now, you know, whether from Colombia, whether from Argentina, whether from Chile, like, we're getting so many great designers coming out of, you know, South Central America and the Caribbean, that I think are great.
So in the book, you talk about Chonga style. You'll have a section for it, which I love. And as a Miami native, I think it makes so much sense to me. I grew up with that Chonga style around me. When I was growing up, it was more of I would say, like, it was more of a derogatory thing, but I see how now it's been reclaimed, and I love how, like, generations have reclaimed that. In the book, there's a quote that says, "If I considered myself a feminist, it would be critical to understand the Chonga or Bratz Miami aesthetic as an expression of resistance to U.S. assimilation and respectability politics," writes author and professor Jillian Hernandez. "Our styles are often read in the U.S. as tacky, over-the-top, and deviant, even as they are simultaneously spectacularized, desired, and appropriated." Why did you decide to include that quote in the book?
I loved Professor Jillian Hernandez's take on this. She's written a lot of articles for Refinery 29. She's been interviewed by a number of publications as well. And she also has this book, The Aesthetic of Excess. And then she celebrates and studies and writes about just the aesthetic of like Black culture and Latina culture. Which are usually like, when it comes to style, it's always like kind of crass, or it's seen as crass. But it's also such a powerful expression of what it is to be Latina. But I really love to research, and I think when you're writing a book, like, you always need to pay credit to the people who kind of spark the ideas that you might kind of base your writing off of. Because when you're writing about history, like, you're not really writing original thoughts always. Right. You're writing about what happened, and you're pulling off of research. And if there's research that sparks a new interest or sparks a new point of view that you may not have had before, you may not have thought about, I think it's important to like include and quote those people that had those original thoughts. So in reading a lot of her research and writing, I was able to contextualize how I felt about it, because I grew up in Miami, like between Hialeah and Miami Lakes.
Same.
Yeah. So, and I was a wannabe Chonga, and my mom was like too fina to let me. Yeah. But like, I made her, like, I dragged her into like rave, it was like rave and like US tops, and she's like, Ashley, no tenemos que ir. And I was like, yeah. And I was like, you know, I wanted my Brazilian jeans and like the little like baseball tee with like, you know, the hoop earrings and all of that. I never quite was able to dress like a Chonga, but I appreciated it and I liked it. So I loved reading her research because it recontextualized what was something that I kind of took for granted, like, oh yeah, Chonga style. But it gave it context, and it gave it substance, and it made it important. And I absolutely love that she researched that, because I think, you know, the sort of like Mexican, like the Chicana aesthetic.
Right. I was just going to say that, yeah. Yeah,
it's like you have the Chicana aesthetic and you have sort of like the New Yorker aesthetic. And I think that sort of style, like, it's taken seriously. You know, it's been written about as this expression of culture, and it's kind of tough, and it's very like, don't mess with me. And, you know, like the Chonga Girls video, it's great. It's a celebration, and they brought it to light, but they also did what Miamians do so well, which is we love to poke fun of ourselves, and we love to take something and throw it back at ourselves as a joke, which that's who Miamians are, right? Like, we take things with like a sort of brevity and lightness. But I loved reading her research because it gave it weight and it gave it depth, and it sort of put into words what I was trying to put in. So it was important for me to sort of to highlight her. And I think with like sort of the emergence of Y2K, we're having a reemergence of like Chonga style. So in doing research, I learned that, you know, there's also like sort of like different Chonga cores out there.
I saw there's Gothic Chonga and Dominatrix Chonga.
Right.
I don't know anything about that.
Right. I didn't either, but and also the core cycle is so quick. So like, you know, that was a blip in history for 1 week, and, you know, does it exist the next week? Like, are we still core? Yeah. I don't know. By the time this comes out, there'll be like another cycle. But I love the reclaiming of it. And I love that, you know, I feel like at one point, you know, you dress like a Chonga out of necessity, right? Like, you lived around Westland Mall or Mall of the Americas, and you created this culture because you didn't have a lot of money, or your parents didn't make a lot of money, and you had to look cute to like go to the mall and go to the movies or go to the basketball court to like look hot for a guy, and you wore these things out of necessity, and you wanted to stand out even if you didn't have that much money, and you wanted to express that sort of Latina, your identity, whether you wanted to emphasize that you were Latina or not. It was your like sexy girl identity.
And I think there's also something to say it's also something we always saw around us, right? Yeah. So you want to fit in, like you want to, that's just what's around you at the time. So I love that like with the research in the book, it's taken, it gave it like you said, it contextualized it and it put it on a national scale. Like, just like with Chicano style and Eureka style, like this was our kind of Chonga aesthetic that at the time we just never thought of it. I mean, at least I never thought of it that way.
No, I didn't either. It was also something like you moved away from. Like you eventually, like you made some money and then you were like, okay, now I dress, I wear the nice fabrics and the nice this, but it's so original and it's so unique. And it was important for me to include that into the book because that is as Miami Vice. And maybe it may not be on such a global scale, and it may not be something that like the tourism board wants to market, right? Like that's sort of, that's the chapter you skip over. That's the neighborhoods you drive by, but it's an important part of the city. And I think to me, if I'm writing about Miami, I put the responsibility on myself to make sure that like I'm writing about what happens on the other side of I-95.
Right.
Because it's not that that's the real Miami. All of Miami is the real Miami.
Right.
Like, even the very transient areas, even South Beach, like that's real. But that's not the full story. And I think when you have the opportunity to talk about Miami and you're from here, you're born and raised here, you have the most unique and the realest perspective of it, you've got to push it forward. And not always as a joke and not always as pointing, fingers at yourself as a city. Like, we're not just Pitbull and we're also that, but we're not just that.
Yeah.
And there's also depth and meaning to that as well.
Exactly.
And I think it's important for us to take ourselves as a city and as people in this city and as people born and raised in the city seriously.
Right.
And to think about the really unique culture that we grew up here and give it more context.
Right. I agree with that. And they definitely got the right writer and journalist to write this book, because just that you were like, I need to include that is amazing, because that's it's a part of our city, no matter how marketable it is,
Absolutely. And I think it also goes to like, I made sure to include Two Live Crew, for example, because it's not high-end fashion, but, you had this period in the 80s and 90s where like, the shorts got shorter, like shorter, way, 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 way shorter. Right. And like, right now we're a very body conscious city. We are sexy as hell, and we use our bodies are a part of the outfits, not just, the vehicle with which to wear what we're wearing. Like they're a part of it, whether we want it to be or not. Like our pants are a little tighter, like our shirts go a little lower. I talked to a stylist, Elias Held, and she's like, yeah, I style women from, in Palm Beach and here, and I get them the same thing. And somehow in Miami, it's just like, just a little more pulled up and a little tighter and like a little more va-va-voom. And that's who we are as a city. And I think that's not because, outsiders came in. It's because that was born on the streets.
Right.
Like that, our sexiness was really born on the streets, and it kind of meshes and blends in with the image of Miami that we sell.
Right.
And I think, Latinos, like Black culture and whatnot, like we don't give them enough credit, or we don't give ourselves enough credit, but we highly influence fashion, even if it's not maybe a specific designer brand. But it's the way things fit and the way that we wear things, like, tighter or with more gold or flashier or like bigger. That comes from the streets. Yeah. And I think it was super important to be able to display that and talk about it alongside things that maybe feel more high end, like all the models coming to South Beach and like Versace. Like that was also a part of our fashion story, but so was Chonga style.
Exactly.
Sort of simultaneously.
And that's also part of our city, like just to be unapologetic about the way that you want to look. I think Miami does a really good job at making you feel like you can go out and wear whatever you want, because everyone is wearing something probably extravagant or, something you might not expect.
Absolutely. So I think the only time someone will look at you like, oh, you're not from around here, is if you're a little too covered up.
Yeah, exactly.
And I love that. I think the other day I was offended. It was so stupid. I was like at a restaurant, and I looked, and there was like a girl, and she came in like a Lily Pulitzer dress with a sweater in the middle of the summer and like a little preppy headband. And I was like, did she not read the notes? Like, this is Miami.
You knew immediately she was not from here.
No, it was a bachelorette party, but
Yeah,
I was also offended. I was like, who wears a sweater to a bachelorette party?
Exactly. You had a Carrie moment.
I had a Carrie moment. And then I was like, okay, stop. She's having a great time.
I love that.
But yeah, it was you only look out of place in Miami if you're a little too covered up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about the evolution of Miami and Miami style. How do you feel like your style has evolved living here?
Well, I was born, raised, and I've only ever lived here. So I think I would say I probably, growing up in Miami, I dress a lot more body conscious than I might if I had grown up somewhere else or I lived somewhere else. So like, I will make my jeans tighter and I will like, make that dress just, a little shorter and whatnot. And that's what I feel comfortable in, because you feel more comfortable when you're a little bit sexier in Miami, in my opinion. Whatever that means for you. But I think it's probably, I dress a lot brighter and a lot more colors. I always make sure to like look at fabrics. Like it's got to be light because it's hot year round. So if I see something like too heavy, even if I'm traveling somewhere else, like I won't pick it up. I'm like, I have no need for this. So a lot of light fabrics, a lot of, color, and just in general, I think there's like a sort of playfulness to our style here, that it's not playful in terms of, too kitschy, but like we do use a lot of patterns and colors and like, emphasizing our curves. And I think growing up in Miami, that's just second nature.
Right.
Whereas maybe if I had grown up somewhere else, it would be something that I would have to learn. But, body conscious dressing is a very Miami thing. And I think growing up here has made me that, whether I was meant to be that or not.
I feel that. I think the same for me. Yeah. We're a fun city.
Yeah. I would love to wear like a Peter Pan collar, and I put it on. I'm like, ¿Quién te crees?
Right.
Like, this
or
is
like
not...
a trench. When I was living in Massachusetts, I was like, should I wear a trench?
Right.
Like, I didn't even know how to dress for the winter.
And you look in the mirror, like, who is this woman?
Yeah.
Does she speak Spanish?
Exactly. That's funny. I have a quick rapid fire Q&A for you. Nothing bad. All good things. I promise. Okay. Colada or cortadito?
Cortadito.
Gold hoops or nameplate necklace?
Gold hoops.
Chancletas in public, yes or no?
Yes.
Favorite Miami thrift spot?
I like Peachtree, most because it's close to where I live.
If Miami had an official color palette, what would be in it?
Pink.
What's one fashion trend that screams Miami for better or worse?
Anything neon.
Most underrated Miami designer or brand?
Underrated. JBQ.
Describe Miami style in one word.
Hot.
I love that. Thank you so much, Ashley. Let us know where we can purchase your book.
Absolutely. It's available at Books and Books, which is a local Miami bookstore. It's also available on Amazon, at Anthropology, at Target, and Barnes & Nobles.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming again, and congratulations.
Thank you for having me and, being able to celebrate our amazing city.
Awesome.
And Latina, and all the Latinas who make it.